Welcome back. What I want to do now is to give you 10 of the critical characteristics of a seed project. Now these 10 characteristics did not come out of a textbook. We've been doing seed projects since 1986 around the world. And every one of these 10 characteristics have come out of the experience of the seed projects that we've done. And the more of these characteristics that are included in the planning and execution of a seed project, in general, the more successful that seed project will be in terms of the demonstration of God's love. So again, I don't want you to think that these 10 characteristics are ideas that came out of our heads. No. We began to realize and see some consistency between what was being done and the success of what was being done, at least the visible success, and we began to compare what was happening in those, and we saw that the more of these characteristics that were implemented or included in a seed project, the more successful it was. So we share these. And these characteristics are not laws, but they're characteristics that you should consider as you plan your seed project. And if you decide to not include one of them, there should be a good reason for that. Okay, let's begin. The first one is that a seed project is motivated by God's intentions, not on the basis of the needs in the community. Most human and secular and even Christian NGOs, their response, the things that they do to respond to a community, is to look at what the needs are. And they prioritize the needs and choose one of those needs, and then that's the one that they design their project around. That's not where you start with a seed project. The place you start is on your knees. And you ask God, what do you want us to do? Not what is the greatest priority in terms of our community needs survey, but what do you want us to do in this situation? Let me tell you a story. In the very early years of our ministry, there was an incredibly poor village in Mexico. And they were, I don't have time to tell you the whole story, but they were producing the only income they had by growing marijuana. The government sent in helicopters to spray and to kill their marijuana, and they in turn shot through the plexiglass window of the helicopter and killed the pilot and the co-pilot. The government couldn't find them because these were mountain people and they knew how to stay away from the federales who came in. Through a series of miracles, God led a missionary to these guys in the hills. And the leaders of this community became converted at one time. And they asked the missionary, okay, now that we're following Christ, now that we're following Jesus, what should we do? Well, if you'd been a typical Western missionary, you'd have said, well, wow, you guys need sanitation, you need clean running water, you need a school, you need a clinic. Yeah, wow. But the missionary wisely said, I don't know, but God does. Why don't we go into the forest and fast and pray and ask God what he wants you to do as new believers? They did that. They were illiterate, but he read scripture to them. They spent a lot of time in prayer, and they fasted and prayed for 3 days. When they came out of the jungle, they believed that God had spoken to them this way. The first thing I want you to do as my followers is to build houses for the 7 widows in your community. This community had been through a long series and history of blood feuds where one person would kill another one because of what was going on in their community. And there were 7 widows as a result of these blood feuds. And God, instead of telling them to put in a clean water system or to build a clinic or to start a school, he said, the first thing I want you to do is to build houses. These guys did not live in houses. I was there. And they were hovels, pigs and chickens living with the people. It was awful. But in obedience, that's what these guys did. They built 7 houses. Now, in that culture, if you were going to build a house, the very first people you build it for would be the leaders of the community, not the widows who were at the very bottom of the social scale. News of what had happened in that little community named Teposanalco spread through the whole state of Guerrero. And leaders from villages all over the area came to see what in the world possessed the leaders of this village to build houses for the lowest status people in the community. And you know what happened? A revival broke out in the region of Teposanalco. People had seen a demonstration of love by a God that they'd never known before. God knew what was needed. And what was needed did not come from a list of priorities that was developed by a community needs survey. I'm not against community needs surveys, because that helps us to understand the needs at least that we can see. So the first characteristic of a seed project is that we don't do what appears to be something that is going to meet the greatest visible need in the community. What we do is we look to see, or said in a different way, we listen to hear what God knows is the greatest need. Second characteristic is it's covered in prayer. Too many times as Christians, we often sort of have a perfunctory prayer at the beginning of our efforts to demonstrate God's love. God, please bless what our plans are. No, rather remember what Nehemiah did all through the building of the wall in Jerusalem. Much bigger than a seed project, but the same principle applies. Nehemiah prayed all through that process of building the wall, the opposition that he faced. And we need to do the same thing in our projects. We need to cover what we do from beginning through the project to the end in prayer. The third characteristic is that it's simple and short. We don't try to eat the elephant. And sometimes in a context I say, how do you eat an elephant? And my African friends immediately know what the answer to that is. You eat it one bite at a time. Well, the same thing is true in terms of what we do as seed projects. A seed project is not going to solve the problem, but you take a bite out of the problem. And so it needs to be very simple and very short. Don't try to start a daycare center, which takes forever, or don't try to get government funding, for a nutritional program that's ongoing. That's not a seed project. It's not a bad thing, but it's not the way to get started. And so whatever we do as a seed project, remember, seed projects are a way to get started, is that it's simple and short. The fourth characteristic is that it's well planned. One of the problems in many churches, especially those that come from a Pentecostal orientation, is you get a great idea and you just go do it without planning for it, about thinking about what resources are going to be needed, about who's going to do what, et cetera, And the project often fails because it wasn't well planned. The fifth characteristic is that it's done with local resources. Now, local resources aren't just the resources that come from the pockets of the people in the church. If it comes from the community, that can be a resource. I can remember in the Dominican Republic, one of the churches that we worked with, they built a bridge over a small stream, and they didn't have the money to do that. So what they did is they went to a local hardware store, told them what they were planning on doing, and said, would you donate the concrete? Would you donate the rebar? And from different ferreterias, hardware stores, they were able to get enough resources to be able to build the bridge. That's local resources. What's not a local resource is getting money from the government, getting money from, an outside denomination. No, it needs to be done locally. The sixth characteristic is that it doesn't manipulate. You're probably asking the question, what do you mean it doesn't manipulate? Do you know what? Christians are great at manipulating. Now, if I told you about what happens in many Islamic communities, you would recognize it, but you don't recognize the very same thing that we do. For example, I know in Ethiopia that you've got Muslims going to poor communities and saying, if you'll become a Muslim, we will pay the tuition of your child, or we will pay your health needs, your hospital needs. You immediately, don't you, recognize that as manipulation. But do you recognize that Christians do the same thing? How many of the newsletters that we get from our missionaries talk about projects that they're doing in order to win people to Christ? You say, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is that God doesn't manipulate. You remember the story of the healing of the 10 lepers? Do you think that Jesus didn't know that only one would come back? If Jesus was healing those 10 lepers in order for them to come back to him in recognition of their healing and thanksgiving for their healing, how many would he have healed? One. How many did he heal? 10. Why? Because he was reflecting God's heart. And he healed those 10 lepers and would have healed them even if none would have come back. The rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. We are to demonstrate God's love irrespective of the consequences, because it's a reflection of God's heart. We have to be very careful that our seed projects don't manipulate. We simply do it because it's an expression of God's love. Number 7, it's done for those outside the church. One of the difficulties in our Christian activity is often that what we do for those in the church, and we should. But a seed project is designed specifically to demonstrate God's love for those who are on the outside, who otherwise would never be touched by God's love. And that's why we make this a criteria. Yes, do we want people to come to Christ with every passion that's in our being? But we don't manipulate them to do that. And they're not going to come to Christ by being touched by his love unless we go outside of the church to demonstrate his love out there. So, number 7 is we do seed projects for those outside the church. And number 8, and this is really something that's so easy to do. wrong. What we do, what the criteria is that we engineer and we plan the seed project in such a way that those who are being helped, if they possibly can participate in their being helped. You remember the story of Ruth and Boaz in the Bible. Boaz could easily have just given Ruth the grain that she needed for herself and her mother-in-law, Naomi. But he didn't do that. Instead, he allowed her to go behind the reapers and gather the grain herself. Why? Because that acknowledged her dignity as a human being. God gave us dignity which is expressed through our own labor and our own work. And so wherever possible, when we do a seed project, we need to build in the process of allowing those that we're helping to be a part of the project. One of the things that is really discouraging to me is the North American habit of sending a group of kids down across the border into Mexico to build houses for the poor. And as being North Americans, we're very well organized. We send somebody down to make sure that the lumber and the cement and whatever else is needed is in place, because we've only got a week and we've got to get this house, the foundation poured, the slab poured, put up the walls and the roof, and make sure it can all be done within a week. And we don't need any interruptions, including the interruption of the family that we're trying to build a house for helping. So what happens? The family that the house is being built for stands around the outside because as the kids have come and said, "Can I help? What can I do?" They say, "No, as Americans, we say, no, that's okay. We've got it planned." What we really are saying is we don't have the time to be interrupted from finishing the project so we can take pictures of it and go back home and show our local church what great people we are. Let me ask you a question. Which is better? That we finish the project or that we give the family the dignity of recognizing their ability to participate in their own healing? So the principle is that those are helped are able to participate in the project. That's characteristic number 8. Number 9. Remember the window of the 4 areas in which Jesus grew: wisdom, physically, socially, spiritually. Well, our seed project needs to try to build into it impacts in all of those areas so that the people being served can see God's love for them, not just in the physical area, but in wisdom and in the social area, in the spiritual area as well. So we need to intentionally plan for a holistic impact. Finally, when the project is done, who gets the glory? Do we want the people to come around and say to us, "Oh, what wonderful folks you are"? Or do we want them to say, "What a good God you have. I want to know more about him"? So the final characteristic is that God is praised, not us. Now, if we're praised along with it, that's fine. But we want to draw attention to the reason we're there, and that's God and his great compassionate love. Okay, 10 characteristics. Motivated by God's intentions, covered in prayer. It's simple and short. It's well planned. It's done with local resources. It doesn't manipulate. It's done outside the church for those outside the church. The beneficiaries participate. It's intentionally holistic, and finally, God is praised. Okay, in this break, I want you to try and to memorize the purpose, okay, the definition, the benefits, and the 10 characteristics. Okay, we'll give you enough time during the break for you to memorize those. And I'm going to give you a test afterwards to see how much you've remembered.